I walked outside holding a cup of coffee, still wearing pajama pants and mismatched slippers, when I noticed a bright orange paper stapled to my old wooden fence. At first, I thought it was a prank, maybe a teenager's idea of a joke. But as I got closer, I saw the HOA letterhead glaring at me like a court summons. Violation 14B. Immediate eviction proceedings. Reason: broken fence panel. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. I had survived 2 layoffs, a basement flood, and a kitchen fire. But apparently, my biggest threat was a slightly leaning piece of wood. That's when I saw her. Karen Withers, HOA president, standing across the street in her robe and pearls like some budget villain from a reality show, smirking like she had just conquered Rome. She waved. I raised my coffee in salute. She mouthed the words, "You're done." She had no idea what she had just started. The thing about my fence was that it wasn't even technically broken. It had a visible crack near the bottom rail, and one panel leaned slightly forward after a bad storm 2 weeks ago, but I had already ordered the replacement parts. I planned to fix it over the weekend. Still, Karen didn't waste a second. By that evening, a group of 3 HOA board members were walking the property line like cops investigating a drug bust. They were taking pictures, pointing fingers, and scribbling notes as if the fence had single-handedly destabilized the entire neighborhood. One guy even used a level tool against it and dramatically gasped like he'd discovered a crime scene. That evening, I received a printed envelope, hand-delivered, not mailed, stating that I was in violation of community structural codes and was to vacate my property within 10 days or face legal eviction. I stared at the document and laughed again, not because it was less absurd, but because now I was sure they weren't joking. I half expected hidden cameras to jump out and say I was on some new HOA prank show, but no. This was real. I called the HOA office, and guess who picked up? Karen. Her voice was calm but smug. She said, "We're just enforcing the rules. If we let your fence stand, it lowers the value for the whole street. We can't allow that." I replied, "It's a fence, not a sinkhole." She hung up. The next day, I watched Gary, the so-called neighborhood compliance officer, patrol past my house on his Segway like he was guarding the Pentagon. He paused at the same panel, tapped it with his foot, and nodded like a man satisfied with justice being served. Then he snapped a few more photos. Margot, another board member, walked by with a clipboard and camera, whispering into a Bluetooth headset as if reporting me to a command center. I couldn't believe this level of obsession over a wooden panel. Karen didn't stop there. She began mailing citations for things like improper mulch coloration and unapproved garden gnome design. I don't even own a garden gnome. She fined me for overgrown hedges, when my hedges were literally trimmed 2 days prior by professionals. It was clear that this wasn't about the fence anymore. It was about power and control. Karen had found her new target, and she was coming after me with every clause in the HOA handbook. Rather than panic, I did what any rational, mildly irritated, and slightly vindictive person would do. I started reading. I pulled up the entire HOA charter, its amendments, the legal bylaws, and every annual report I could get my hands on. It was long, boring, and filled with enough legal mumbo-jumbo to make anyone's eyes glaze over. But I had time, and I had a reason now. I highlighted sections, made notes, and even used sticky tabs like I was prepping for the bar exam. And that's when I found it. A small clause, buried in the middle of the original HOA charter from the late 1990s, allowed for any party holding a majority voting interest in the property management trust to motion for a restructuring of the board. In simple terms, if someone owned enough influence, they could call for an election. I also discovered that the HOA wasn't being managed by a third party, but was run through a private community trust, one that had quietly sold off shares to raise capital years ago. That trust was still active. I had worked in corporate real estate acquisitions for over a decade before switching careers. Let's just say I knew what I was looking at. And what I saw was opportunity. I checked the public records, and sure enough, some of those original shareholders still lived in the community, or had passed those shares on to their families. Some were clearly just waiting for the chance to challenge Karen's reign. Over the next few days I started making calls. Quietly, calmly. I didn't tell anyone about the eviction notice. I didn't let Karen know I was doing anything at all. I just played dumb, smiled at her during morning walks, and waved back when she waved from her porch throne. At night, I made spreadsheets. I drafted letters. I wrote up polite inquiries to longtime neighbors who had been burned by Karen's antics, people like Mr. Price down the block, who had once been fined for leaving his garage open during the day, or the Wilsons, whose child's birthday balloon decorations were deemed visual clutter. I asked questions. I listened. And most importantly, I found out who had the power to vote. By the end of that week, I had secured private meetings with 3 key individuals who held a controlling interest in the trust. 2 of them admitted they had been looking for a way to get rid of Karen for years. The third, an elderly woman named Mrs. Halverson, had a story so ridiculous I almost didn't believe it. Karen once reported her to animal control because her cat looked too aggressive from the sidewalk. That sealed it. As the weekend approached, Karen began to escalate. She mailed me a second notice, this time referencing possible civil damages from my fence's deterioration. I could practically hear her cackling behind the scenes, thinking she was tightening the noose. I let her believe it. She had no idea I had already set the match to the fuse beneath her entire empire. On Sunday morning, I stood on my porch sipping coffee again, this time looking at the same fence that started it all. A small crack, a slight lean, and a future she could never see coming. Karen walked by, paused across the street, and smiled her wicked little smile. I smiled back. 10 days, she called out. Or sooner, I replied. Because if she thought she was going to evict me over a fence, she was about to learn what happens when the fence fights back. If Karen thought her power trip stopped at my fence, she must have spent the last 10 years watching reruns of dictatorship documentaries and taking note. After that eviction notice, she didn't let up, she doubled down. Every morning began with a new petty offense tucked into my mailbox or zip-tied to my doorknob like some twisted advent calendar. One morning it was a decorative wind chime exceeding community audio decibel limits. The next, it was an accusation that my solar lights were unauthorized reflective hazards. I didn't even have solar lights. She had created a fantasy HOA warzone where everything I owned was suddenly against regulation, and she was the only sheriff in town. Gary, her loyal lapdog, was making his patrols more frequent now. He had added a flashing orange vest to his Segway getup and started carrying a clipboard that might as well have been blank. He stopped outside my house every morning and stared at the fence like it personally offended him. Sometimes he would kneel beside it, tap the base, then look around suspiciously, as if he expected it to detonate. Margot followed close behind, usually whispering into her headset like she was reporting a drug bust. One time I saw her snap a picture of my trash can and mark something on her sheet. I started wondering if I should charge them rent for camping out in front of my property. But as comical as it was, there was real venom behind their antics. Several neighbors began telling me Karen had turned her sights on them too. She fined Mr. Lee for letting his grandkids chalk on the sidewalk. She threatened to report a single mom down the street because her car had dust accumulation. The entire community started walking on eggshells. Garage doors stayed shut even during barbecues. Curtains were drawn. Children stopped playing in the street. Karen wasn't just enforcing the rules, she was trying to scare people into submission. That's when I decided it was time to do more than just defend myself. I needed to show people they weren't alone in this. So I hosted a barbecue. Not just any barbecue, an underground HOA resistance meeting disguised as a Sunday cookout. I sent out invitations personally, careful to avoid the usual HOA busybodies. No flyers, no group text. Just real conversations. I invited anyone who'd ever had a Karen encounter that ended with a fine, warning, or threat. I stocked up on burgers, ribs, cold drinks, and one special item, a piñata shaped like a tiny baize mailbox. People showed up with nervous energy like we were gathering in a secret rebellion camp. Mr. Price came wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap like he was entering witness protection. The Wilsons brought beer and a folder of photos showing Margot snapping pictures of their inflatable Santa Claus. Even the new couple on Maple Drive, who'd just moved in and already been fined twice for inappropriate patio furniture, showed up with confused grins. We kept it casual at first, music, food, laughter. But as the sun dipped and the sky shifted into warm amber, the stories started spilling out. It was like opening a dam. People talked about how Karen screamed at a teenage girl for having a temporary hair dye that clashed with neighborhood aesthetics. Others described threats of legal action over things as small as a misplaced lawn chair or a slightly overgrown bush. What struck me most wasn't the absurdity, it was the fear. Grown adults, homeowners, military vets, and parents all afraid of one woman with a laminated handbook and too much free time. I listened more than I spoke. When the timing was right, I told them what I'd discovered. The hidden ownership clause, the private management trust, and my quiet efforts to reach out to the key stakeholders. At first, the room went quiet. People weren't sure whether to believe me or whether this was just more HOA fantasy politic. But then I pulled out the document. I showed them how the trust had sold voting shares years ago to raise capital, how those shares were still active, and how 3 key holders were now ready to vote for new leadership. The energy shifted instantly. What had begun as a barbecue turned into a battle strategy session. Mr. Price sat up straighter. The Wilsons leaned in. Even the shy woman from Birch Lane, who hadn't said a word all night, suddenly asked if she could help canvass the neighborhood. The community had been under siege for so long, they'd forgotten they had the power to fight back. Now they had a plan. Over the next few days, we worked quietly but relentlessly. I assigned roles like we were planning a campaign. Some neighbors reached out to other shareholders under the radar. Others gathered written statements detailing Karen's abuse of power. We started documenting everything: photos, letters, timestamps, video recordings. Every ridiculous citation, every petty threat, every HOA overreach. One neighbor had security camera footage of Karen walking up to his porch and measuring his flower pots with a tape measure. Another had audio of her screaming about color integrity when a child's birthday banner didn't match the community's neutral palette. Meanwhile, I met again with Mrs. Halverson, one of the majority shareholders. She was retired, sharp as ever, and absolutely thrilled to learn that Karen might finally be on her way out. She handed me an entire manila folder filled with old HOA documents, including an expense sheet where Karen approved $1,200 to be spent on a board leadership retreat at a local spa. I couldn't believe my luck. This was gold. Karen, of course, had no idea any of this was happening. She continued her patrols and citations with increasing aggression. She even added a new rule proposal banning all outdoor furniture unless uniformly beige, black, or slate. When a neighbor dared question it, Karen responded by threatening to remove them from the next community yard sale. I watched it all like someone preparing for a chess game, calmly noting each move she made, each enemy she created. Then came the letter that proved she was completely out of control. Karen issued a formal warning to an elderly veteran named Joe because his American flag was too weathered. That man had served 3 tours and nearly lost his leg in the line of duty. The flag had been folded by his commanding officer and given to him at his retirement. When Joe refused to take it down, Karen fined him $300 and threatened legal action. That's when I knew this wasn't just about property anymore. This was about respect, dignity, and standing up to someone who thought a rulebook gave her the right to trample on people. I called an emergency strategy meeting that night. We reviewed everything. We were ready. The signatures were secured. The majority shares were lined up. The legal documents were prepared. It was time to take the final steps. I drafted the paperwork requesting a special election of the board under the provisions of the HOA's own charter. Once delivered, they would have no choice but to comply within 30 days. We were going to make it official and public. By the time the court date arrived, I was more amused than anxious. It was hard to take Karen's grandstanding seriously when I knew what was coming. She had spent the last 2 weeks acting like a queen awaiting coronation, floating around the neighborhood in her floral print sundresses and pearls like she'd already declared victory. She told anyone who would listen that I was facing removal, that the HOA had unified support, and that my property would soon be restored to code compliance under new ownership. Meanwhile, I was finalizing a different kind of paperwork, one that had nothing to do with fences and everything to do with control. But before I could pull the rug out from under her, I had to get through this circus she called an eviction hearing. The county courtroom was a dull beige room with flickering lights and cracked floor tiles, but Karen walked in like it was a royal courtroom. She was draped in a navy blue power suit, clutching a leather binder so full it looked like it might pop open and explode HOA citations across the room. Behind her was a real estate agent she'd dragged along to appraise my home after she assumed I'd lose. The smugness radiating off her face could have lit up the building. She didn't acknowledge me when I entered. Instead, she leaned over to Gary and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Enjoy your last day on his porch. We'll have his house listed by next Tuesday." I sat quietly, dressed in a simple button-up, no lawyer beside me, just a folder and a calm smile. Karen didn't know I'd retained a legal heavyweight who specialized in HOA overreach and had once written a state-level policy reform that made national news. But more importantly, she didn't know that my attorney was already in the courtroom. She just didn't recognize her. The judge entered, a man with thick glasses, salt and pepper hair, and the kind of expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else. But when Karen began her opening remarks with a theatrical performance detailing my refusal to comply with basic neighborhood standards, he blinked twice and leaned forward with visible irritation. Karen continued, pointing to large, printed images of my fence with exaggerated red arrows and the word danger scrawled across them like we were looking at a bomb site. She spoke of neighborhood property values, of community standards, of the moral duty to maintain suburban beauty. It was like listening to someone campaign for HOA president of the world. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, calmly placed 3 photos on the evidence table, and gave a short statement. I explained how the damage to the fence occurred during an HOA contracted landscaping session and provided timestamps, before and after photos, and even a video of Gary's crew accidentally slamming a mower into the panel. Then I handed over an invoice showing I had already paid for repair supplies weeks ago, along with a dated delivery confirmation. The judge raised an eyebrow. Karen tried to object. She stood and accused me of manipulating evidence, then turned red when the judge asked why the HOA had ignored my repair offer days before the citation. She stuttered, then launched into a rambling rant about HOA sovereignty and neighborhood tradition. That's when my attorney stood up. Calmly, confidently, she introduced herself and stated she had full legal representation rights on my behalf. Karen turned white as a sheet when she recognized her name. She had clearly heard of her before. My attorney then pulled out the real paperwork, the HOA financial records we'd quietly obtained during the discovery phase of the audit. She read out the charges. Unauthorized spending on spa treatments, luxury dinners under the guise of board meetings, and a weekend getaway at a resort labeled as HOA educational training. Every expense was linked back to Karen's personal credit card and signed by her as approved treasurer. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge, who had remained stone-faced until now, finally spoke. He asked Karen directly if she had documentation proving board approval for these expenses. She hesitated. Then she muttered that it wasn't the issue being tried. The judge disagreed. Not only was the financial misconduct relevant, he said, but it also raised serious concerns about the HOA's motivations for eviction. He stated he would be issuing an immediate freeze on HOA enforcement actions against me and referred the matter for independent financial review. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Gary shifted uncomfortably beside her, and the real estate agent slowly slid his portfolio back into his briefcase. The judge dismissed the eviction attempt on the spot and told Karen that any further attempts to enforce HOA actions against me until the review was completed would be considered harassment and subject to fines. She left the courtroom muttering curses under her breath. I didn't celebrate right away. The court win was necessary, but it was only a small part of the plan. Back at home, I briefed the rest of the neighborhood. We had been operating like a quiet underground movement, but after that court decision, the gloves came off. More people joined us. More files were handed over. More emails surfaced. What we found wasn't just embarrassing, it was criminal. Karen had misused HOA funds to the tune of thousands of dollars, often cloaked under vague terms like community morale events or member enrichment. One receipt was for a portable hot tub rental, supposedly for board therapy discussions. That image alone nearly started a riot in our group chat. But the best part was still ahead. With the freeze in place, Karen had to pause all HOA actions. She couldn't fine people. She couldn't issue new citations. She couldn't even hold board meetings without notifying everyone first. She tried to push a new emergency rule allowing her to bypass the freeze, but that backfired when her attempt to pass it without a quorum got reported to the state HOA oversight agency. Meanwhile, I finalized the ownership structure with the trust members. Between the shares I had quietly purchased and the ones allied neighbors now controlled, we had over 60% of the voting power. It was enough. The next step was calling a vote. I submitted the motion for a board restructuring and an emergency election, attaching the signatures, ownership documentation, and supporting legal precedent. It was airtight. Karen received the formal motion on a Friday morning. She tried to stall it, claiming it needed board review, but she was out of moves. The community had turned against her. The moment she posted her rebuttal on the neighborhood forum, a dozen residents countered with their own testimonies. Photos of her screaming at landscapers. A recording of her berating a disabled vet about lawn signs. Even a voicemail where she accidentally left a message trashing residents who don't respect the beige code. We scheduled the election. We didn't do it quietly either. Flyers went up. Emails were sent. Neighbors knocked on doors. People who hadn't been involved in years suddenly showed up ready to vote. Karen tried to hold her own official HOA meeting to confuse the timeline, but no one showed up, except Margot and Gary, who were now more liabilities than allies. The rest of the board members, feeling the pressure, began stepping back and distancing themselves from her chaos. The morning after the election, the air in the neighborhood felt lighter. It was subtle, like the first breeze after a long storm. For the first time in years, no one was peeking nervously through their blinds or walking with their heads down. Kids played in front yards again. Someone even strung up a banner that read "Welcome Back Freedom" over their driveway. Karen's little reign was over, but the real work had only just begun. Winning the vote was one thing. Taking full control meant pulling the tangled weeds she had buried deep into the roots of our community. And I was more than ready to roll up my sleeves. The first order of business was to call an official board meeting with the newly elected members. We met at the community center with coffee, laptops, and thick binders of evidence we had collected over the past several weeks. There were 7 of us now, representing a wide cross-section of the neighborhood. Mr. Price, the quiet but sharp retired engineer. Jasmine, the single mom who had been fined for birthday decorations. Mike, the young vet with a knack for spreadsheets. Everyone brought something to the table, and more importantly, everyone had one thing in common. We were tired of being bullied by someone who thought neighborhood rules were a weapon. Before the meeting even started, I had already drafted a list of motions. At the top was a full suspension of all ongoing HOA fines and enforcement until we completed an internal audit. We voted unanimously. That one change alone lifted a massive burden off dozens of homeowners who were still battling threats over silly infractions like mailboxes and mulch colors. Next, we reviewed Karen's previous financial expenditures. It was worse than we thought. Over $15,000 had been spent on items that couldn't be justified. Luxury dining, resort stays, designer office furniture, a drone she claimed was for community surveillance. She even approved a payment for silk curtains for her personal office space in her home. The receipts didn't lie. We voted to initiate a formal complaint with the HOA Regulatory Board at the county level. Then came the real moment. The one I had been waiting for since that morning. I found the eviction notice stapled to my fence. With the trust votes and new leadership in place, I now had the authority to restructure the HOA's management company. And I did. On paper, the HOA was a private association managed under a holding trust. I had quietly acquired majority interest in that trust weeks ago, which meant that, effectively, I now owned the HOA. Legally and structurally. I had been patient, silent, methodical, and now, sitting at the head of the table in that community hall, I dropped the final document on the table with a satisfied smile. Everyone went silent as they read it. Then Mike looked up and asked, "Wait, does this mean you can fire Karen permanently?" Not only could I already had. The moment the election results were certified, I filed the restructuring paperwork, and within it was a clause dissolving the old board and nullifying any administrative contracts signed by them. Karen, Gary, and Margot were officially stripped of any roles or titles they had. But I hadn't informed them yet. I had other plans for that. I scheduled a public HOA meeting and invited everyone in the neighborhood. I labeled it Community Restoration and Transparency Session. The idea was to update residents on the changes, show them the audit findings, and let them ask questions. But I also knew Karen would show up. She couldn't resist a stage, especially one she thought still belonged to her. On the day of the meeting, the hall was packed. Folding chairs lined every wall. Neighbors stood in clusters, chatting, laughing, visibly relieved. It felt like a reunion. And then, right on cue, in walked Karen wearing a bright red jacket like she was still queen of the block. Gary followed behind, confused and uncomfortable. Margot walked in like she was attending a funeral. Karen strutted to the front, took one look at me standing near the podium, and said loudly, "I'll take it from here." The chuckle that ran through the room wasn't unkind, but it wasn't supportive either. I let her speak. For 5 minutes, she rambled about community values and protecting neighborhood standards. She mentioned vague threats about illegal elections and warned everyone not to trust people with personal agendas. She even tried to introduce a new motion mid-speech. That's when I stepped forward. I calmly addressed the crowd, thanked Karen for her past service, and then displayed a large poster board listing every expense filed under her tenure. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. I handed out printed summaries to residents. Karen's eyes darted across the room, reading line after line of purchases. The portable hot tub, the wine tasting trip, the custom monogrammed pens. People began whispering. Some started shaking their heads. One man raised his hand and asked, "Are we getting reimbursed for all this?" I responded, "Absolutely." And I'm happy to announce that, moving forward, our budget will be fully transparent and open for public review. Karen tried to interrupt. She demanded the floor back. But that's when the real shock came. I pulled out the document showing the trust restructuring and my legal appointment as managing officer. I read it aloud, line by line. Then, as Karen stood frozen, I turned to her, Gary, and Margot and said, "As of this moment, your positions are officially terminated. Thank you for your time. You are no longer authorized to represent the HOA in any capacity." The silence was deafening. Then someone clapped. Then another. And then the entire room erupted in applause. Gary tried to argue but was drowned out by a neighbor yelling about how he once threatened a child over a sidewalk chalk mural. Margot just sat down and put her head in her hands. Karen turned red. She tried to shout that I was drunk on power. I calmly reminded her that she had tried to evict me over a cracked fence while spending community money on silk napkins for HOA brunches. Then I stepped aside and invited residents to speak. For the next hour, people shared stories. They laughed, cried, ranted, and finally felt heard. One elderly woman stood and said she had considered selling her home just to escape the fear of daily fines. Now she felt like staying. That moment alone made every long night of planning worth it. After the meeting, Karen stormed out. I heard her mutter about lawsuits and revenge, but she knew. Her time was over. The next day, I received an official notification that she had listed her home for sale. Within 2 weeks, the for sale sign was up. Gary disappeared shortly after, and Margot took a sudden extended vacation. Meanwhile, we started rebuilding. We created new committees that actually welcomed volunteers. We launched a digital portal so homeowners could track where funds were going. We removed absurd rules and replaced them with practical, community-approved guidelines. And most importantly, we returned a sense of joy to our neighborhood. Late one evening, I walked the same path Karen used to patrol. I passed houses lit up with string lights, porches decorated with flags, kids riding scooters freely again. And then I paused at my own front gate. The fence was still there. Still cracked. I never fixed it. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to forget. That crack reminded me of where this all began. One panel. One petty woman. One fight. And now, one community stronger than ever. The neighborhood had begun to transform, not just on paper, not just in policies or procedures, but in spirit. The air felt different. For the first time in years, people weren't glancing over their shoulders before putting out a patio chair or wondering if a flower pot might trigger a fine. Laughter carried freely across lawns. Sidewalk chalk returned in bursts of color. Flags fluttered without fear. And the fear that once haunted every mailbox, the fear of Karen's next decree, had vanished like smoke in wind. But just as things began to feel normal again, the final chapter of Karen's saga hit like a thunderclap. 2 weeks after the public HOA meeting that removed her and her cronies, I received an envelope from the county auditor's office. The formal complaint we had filed during our early investigation had triggered more than just a passive review. It had sparked a full-blown audit. The findings were staggering. Not only had Karen misused HOA funds on personal luxuries, but she had also submitted forged board signatures on expense approvals and manipulated meeting minutes to fabricate fake vote. One document even listed Gary as present and voting yes on a policy change from a meeting he was proven to be in another state during. This wasn't just incompetence. It was criminal. Within days, the county sheriff's office requested copies of all HOA financial documents and held interviews with several former board members. 2 of them turned state witness almost immediately. Word spread like wildfire. Karen had gone from neighborhood tyrant to prime suspect in a case of HOA embezzlement and fraud. The day the sheriff knocked on her door was the same day she tried to skip town. I watched from my porch as 2 deputies escorted her to her SUV. She wasn't arrested then, but they handed her an official notice to appear for a deposition. Her face had none of the smugness she used to carry like armor. It was replaced by something unfamiliar, panic. While that storm brewed behind closed doors, we pressed forward with rebuilding. We launched our neighborhood's first true community event in years. A simple block party. Food trucks, music, games for the kids, and no HOA restrictions on decorations, outfit choices, or party hours. The turnout was incredible. Even people who had lived on the street for a decade but never attended events showed up. Old neighbors reconnected. New neighbors felt welcomed. We held a ceremonial burning of HOA violation notices in a metal fire pit, and someone brought cupcakes shaped like fences. Everyone laughed. But the most symbolic moment came when we unveiled the new community charter, a clear, transparent set of guidelines written by and for the people who actually lived there. No fines for creative expression. No punishment for garden gnomes. Just rules that made sense, applied fairly and equally. The new HOA board held open Q&A sessions monthly. Residents could join via Zoom or show up in person. Financial records were posted online. The budget was made public. We even created a community vote system for larger decisions. Trust began to grow where fear used to fester. That growth felt like the best kind of revenge against what Karen had built, because we didn't just take back control. We turned it into something better. But karma wasn't quite done with her. Karen failed to appear at her scheduled deposition. Instead, she tried to have her attorney file a motion claiming medical hardship. The county wasn't buying it. They issued a subpoena. And then, after reviewing the extent of the forged documents and misused funds, the case escalated. Karen was officially charged with misuse of HOA funds, falsification of official records, and obstruction of internal audit. It made the local paper, which featured a large headline with her name and a photo of her walking out of the courthouse trying to hide behind oversized sunglasses. The fallout was immense. Her property, once the most curated and tightly regulated in the whole neighborhood, went up for sale. But buyers were scarce. No one wanted a home so closely tied to such an infamous scandal. Rumors swirled that she was trying to move out of state, possibly to live with a cousin in another town, but nothing ever confirmed it. Gary vanished entirely, and Margot quietly filed a complaint about stress and resigned from public life. No one missed them. With Karen fully out of the picture and the legal process now in the county's hands, I turned back to where it all began, my fence. The panel was still slightly cracked, still leaned ever so slightly forward. And yet, no one had said a word about it in months. Some neighbors even said it should remain untouched, like a monument. One evening, without announcing anything, I took a small brass plate, engraved with the words "The fence that fired a tyrant," and screwed it gently onto the top plank. It didn't scream or stand out. It just quietly sat there, a reminder of what we overcame. That same night, while sitting on my porch sipping a glass of iced tea, I heard footsteps. Mr. Price walked over, holding a cooler of lemonade. He sat beside me, chuckled, and asked if I ever imagined this all starting from one broken board. I told him no, but sometimes the biggest battles start with the smallest cracks. He laughed again and said, "Remember when Karen fined me for using green mulch? Now we've got neighbors planting sunflowers in the middle of their lawns." It felt like the world had been put right again. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting golden light over the homes, kids chased bubbles down the sidewalk, and two teens played guitar on a porch 2 doors down. Everything felt alive again. Free. Someone drove by with a Jeep covered in bumper stickers, something Karen would have written a 5-page citation over. Now it just made people smile. It wasn't just about a fence. It never had been. It was about dignity, community, the right to live in peace without fear of pettiness dressed as policy. Over the next month, we helped other nearby neighborhoods understand their HOA charters better. People began asking if they could borrow our audit template. A few communities even invited me to speak about how we turned our toxic HOA into a functional, people-powered one. I never called myself a leader. I was just a homeowner with a cracked fence and a little too much stubbornness to back down. But sometimes that's all it takes. The final nail in the Karen era came on a quiet Monday morning. A notice from the county court was delivered to our new HOA email. Karen had officially pleaded guilty to several of the charges in exchange for reduced penalties. She avoided jail, but the court ordered her to pay restitution to the HOA in full and banned her from serving on any board or community leadership group for 10 years. The neighborhood board voted unanimously to donate her restitution funds to a new project, a community playground and garden space for residents to enjoy freely, without permits, without inspections, without the ghost of authoritarian beige hovering over it. The groundbreaking ceremony was simple. Neighbors brought shovels, saplings, and folding chairs. Kids made cardboard signs that said things like "No more mean lady" and "We love the new HOA." I gave a short speech, mostly to thank everyone who stood up when it mattered. Then I stood back and watched as the first seeds went into the ground. Not just literal seeds, but the seeds of trust, collaboration, and freedom.